I just spoke with Dr. Shawn Baker a few minutes ago, and I just wanted to do an addendum video where I go in a little bit more depth into most of the topics that we went through. Um, so we talked about anthropology of carnivorism, and one of the claims that I made is that there's been different human populations in different places. There's no such thing as a natural human diet. However, meat, as he pointed out, is a human universal in the sense that there have been animals and there have been animals that humans eat wherever there have been humans. So there's like a distinction between those two things, right? Because the natural diet of a group is the diet that that group like just naturally eats, and there has never been a group that eats exclusively meat on Earth, as far as I know. Same as like vegans, right? There has never been a group of people who eats only plant sources. What we do have is people like the Inuit, for example, which they, by a very large distance, the primary source of food they have is protein and fat from meats. But they also ferment blubber and, bacteria transform that into um, some sort of carbohydrate. And I didn't get to mention that during the discussion. And I do think that like some populations have evolved to be like less damaged by vegetarianism. I mentioned young people, and I do think that young people have had more evolutionary selection pressured from agriculture to like no longer be as dramatically affected. But a small amount of poison is still poison as far as I'm concerned. I think Dr. Shafee got that one in the bag, and I would rather avoid as much poison as possible for as long as possible. So. Um, I talked a little bit about the Izot problem and the naturalistic fallacy. So, for a longer introduction, the naturalistic fallacy is the claim that you can't derive ethical facts just from the physical facts of the world. The question, like, do we know what should be and what should we do conditional on like merely the naturalist's facts about like physics and so on and so forth, physics, biology, and any other field that you think might be in the base layer that constitutes nature. So the naturalistic fallacy is extraordinarily common. A lot of people like automatically presume that you can derive that kind of thing. And then there's the is-ought problem, which is the idea like, can you derive an ought from an is? And Sam Harris, notwithstanding, because his theory is a very like a niche version of something that kind of defies that whole description I gave. Largely speaking, no, you can't really know what to do just conditional on like a series of facts of what's going on. It seems that to the extent that we understand ethics, like there's a there's an overlaying layer that you have to put on top, like and if you do this, that'll happen. If you do this other thing will happen. Some animal will be happy, some human will be happy, some animal will suffer, some human will suffer. But like, which one is good? And that, to some extent, it is for us to decide. And largely speaking, a lot of people, especially people in the effective altruism movement, of which I've been a part since like the early beginning, believe that there's a very large component of that, which is aggregative and homogeneous and consequentialist. So, like, you should measure the goodness of an action by the resulting effects of that action. You can sum the effects of different actions or like the consequences of an action in order to assess whether something is good or bad. And one way to do that, for example, is like, you can be like a preference utilitarian is a variation of that, which is like have a lot of preferences been satisfied, have a lot of preferences been violated, or a hedonic utilitarian, like has this action generated a fair amount of happiness? Has it generated a fair amount of suffering? And you can measure the goodness or badness of an action based off that. So my counter to the vegan, I mean, he's young, and I think that like maybe he would agree with most of my points. The vegan, very silly, very funny guy, Nick, who debated Chen prior, is even though both of us have a component of some sort of positive utilitarianism, like trying to make the world have as many positive mental states as possible. He goes all the way, so he's 100% utilitarian. It seems to me from the way he argues. Whereas I'm a moral pluralist, so I do have a very strong component of utilitarianism, something like 85, 90%. But I do think that there's many other possible things that are also morally valuable in and of themselves. So that's one of the reasons why I wouldn't straight up just push a button that would fill the universe with hedonium, which is computronium. Computronium is the most effective computational structure that you can create for any given volume of physics. Hedonium is like transform those computations into the maximum amount of happiness. I don't even think, I don't even know for sure that computations can actually instantiate mental states. I think that because computer science is a field that makes a lot of money, there have been a lot of intelligent people migrating to computer science, and those people have brought with them a philosophical perspective called computationalism, which is a subset of functionalism. And functionalism states that two entities are mentally equivalent if they're functionally equivalent. And I don't think that this has been fully determined yet. NetBlock made some good arguments for it, but many people have made good arguments against it as well. It's a very complex question in philosophy of mind, extremely sophisticated, not viable for a YouTube video. Point being that we might not necessarily want to arrogantly assume that we know exactly what's best for the world and try to cast the entire world in one direction. Having some level of moral uncertainty would allow us to taper and attenuate that kind of instinct to just colonize everything with hedonium or something like that. And that guy was also arguing for bulldozing the rainforest and build human structure in its stead. I think there's several different things wrong with that. So one is that one of the things that might have some level of value on its own is biodiversity, and the Amazon forest is the most biodiverse part of Earth. I don't think that biodiversity is the ultimate value or more valuable than the mental states of animals that are participating in something. So we want to reduce the amount of animals that are experiencing wild animal suffering while at the same time preserving some level of biodiversity, right? So if there were 15 Amazons, maybe you should bulldoze 14 or 13 of them to prevent existential risk of that particular biofauna, and then let the other two continue existing so that we keep the biodiversity but minimize the animal suffering. And I think in general, that's going to be the orientation that our species is going to move on in the next 5, 6, 7 centuries, which is the direction of satisfying the preferences of those who are extant right now. So that includes all the humans and our preferences first. I'm somewhat speciesist, so I want our species to get enough of a fraction of resources in order to satisfy most of our needs, whether those be things like living a very long time or having whatever Ferrari or something you may like. And then once we're done with that and there's enough human flourishing to as to the point where the returns on using more resources to cause the marginal human to get a very tiny amount more happy no longer makes sense, then we should probably start looking into things like whales and chimps and gorillas and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth, up to the point where we're making every mosquito have a fantastic time, as if he was tripping balls in the best trip of his life. And yeah, so that all depends on the economics of the resources and so on and so forth. And then maybe outside our local supercluster, let's say we take a couple of galaxies for us, or maybe even one, and we use our local resources according to the preferences of the beings that will be alive at the time we reach technological maturity. And maybe you can fill the rest of the universe with hedonium, maybe not. There will definitely be intelligences far greater than mine made artificially in the next 100 years who can think this through better than I could. So, what to do if the non local cluster is kind of outside the scope of what I think is relevant for us to even consider thinking about in 2024. I do think that I under exposed in the level of risk of totalitarianism and so on, because I wanted to make the point that to the extent that we can create chemically indistinguishable meat made of like actual cells, we should actually like go for that, because it is better to like be in a situation such that you have access to meat without it coming from a nervous system that had to suffer. But I wanted to like make clear that up until that day, I'm not going to endorse that, because the other risk is much greater, which is the risk of someone trying to like top down, either weaken the population or maximize profits of products that have low perishability, which are usually like plant-based products or fake meat products and so on and so forth, and that might have chemicals that we don't really know what their effects are in our bodies and so on and so forth. So I do think that like the risk of eat the bugs, so to speak, is significantly high for the short run, but I do think that in the medium run and definitely in the long run, the dominating consideration will be the joy or suffering of the nervous systems that remain extant on Earth. So, we should maximize the amount of meat without nervous system so that we don't have to worry about what it's suffering. We could also make meat that's like having an orgasm like all the time. And if that's easier, fine, because muscles require some level of tension and maybe electric activity to grow in a particular way. So maybe some level of neuroactivity is necessary. Mollusks make me think that's not the case. I don't really think that mollusks are significantly conscious. Nobody knows, but that's kind of my um, baseline assumption regarding mollusks. Um, I didn't get to mention that the carnivore diet has defeated keto on Google Trends about a week ago, and vegan and vegetarian about 2 to 3 years ago. So we're actually like the fastest growing diet now. And I do think that that effect is going to continue, because after the decentralization of information broadcasting from television, which was controlled by like a short amount of people, to the internet, it's very hard to stop things that create like very significant like benefit and gain. And like Tesla doesn't need advertisement, because the Tesla cars are just like significantly better than the other cars in many dimensions, and that's why they never needed like an ad team. And I think that the carnivore diet works so effectively and cures so many different diseases and helps with so many different other diseases, that it's extremely unlikely that like a Darwinian mechanism of like people eating carnivore isn't just going to propagate itself, regardless of any kind of like top down attempts to quash it. So that's my best guess of what is going to happen. Um, yeah, I talked about like my gripe with the carnivore community about like the naturalistic fallacy, the is a problem, the fact that South Asians and some Sudanese seem to be well adapted to veganism. What else do I have? It's kind of like a disparity between my thinking and the thinking of many carnivores. Oh yeah, so I don't think that the Maasai or the Akukuyu also like eat only meat. So there's that. I mean, there's a difference between eating a lot of meat and eating some other things, which is what I think like pretty much a lot of human groups have done for a significant fraction of our lifespan. To expand on the question that Sean asked me about, how long does it take for an adaptation like that to evolve? It really varies, right? It varies because natural selection doesn't really have like a timer or a speedometer or something like that. So mandioca, what's the name? Cassava in English. Cassava is relatively poisonous, but different indigenous peoples in different parts of the world learn to like either mix it up with ash or cook it in a particular way that destroys many of the dangerous like elements of that. And I do think that like that was a relatively like a surprisingly recent advance. And human groups tend to like figure out a lot about the plant environments and the things that are edible around them. One of the two things that always like surprised and impressed me is the Incas were able to grow potatoes at a higher level of altitude and like a slightly different temperature than what potatoes are growable at. They just like somehow they managed to adapt their potatoes by some kind of like artificial selection system that they didn't even know they were doing, and in that process, they got like basically a different species of potato that grows um, circa Machu Picchu and so on and so forth. So that's something that surprised me with like how seemingly evolutionarily fast it evolved. Same thing for like lactose intolerance and the cheeses. There's a significant amount of people who can digest an enormous amount of milk throughout adulthood. Although in that case, you could argue that it's just like we're actually just losing an evolutionary function because all people, while children, can digest milk, so we're just keeping a protein there that was already there. But yeah, there's several different tales of like human evolution where it happens faster than we think it does. And you can just see that like there's been population changes even in the current population of many different countries and environments and so on. And me and Shen got to talk a little bit about like the disparities in intelligence and variations in intelligence, which happen in a relatively short scale. Expanding a little bit on that, like it seems that human intelligence peaked in 1790, as far as we know, and we know that because we can like take a broad scope of genomes and then approximate what those genomes would create in terms of average intelligence. So you can determine intelligences from the past, not of individuals, right? I can't just take like Newton's DNA and determine his intelligence, but I can take like the DNA of the people who lived in the village that Newton lived, and you can estimate their intelligence based off the combination of like genetic material from several different people. I don't know what the minimum number is. Like my brain is telling me 12, but like I might be misremembering. And yeah, so we've been losing 3 G points, I think, every decade. It might have sped down, so it's something like losing 1 G point every decade now. And there was this thing called the Flynn effect. So people were growing IQ by 3 points per decade. That was in part related to like higher levels of iodine, making brain development and body development easier and better. And in general, just nutrition improving and other like medical improvements and health improvements in society in general might also be related. Like we live in a slightly cleaner society now, so there's less danger of some sorts of infectious transmissions and so on that could compromise the development of the brain of people growing up in that particular time. So yeah, those are some of the things that if we had more time, I would have delved into. Mm, we talked a little bit about AI, so giving like a general panorama of how I think about AI. Um, I do think that the current like language models. I mean, they're very effective. I use ChatGPT like all the time, basically as much as Google. And I don't really know where they're going or how far they're going to get in terms of like intellectual development, but it's clear that they're approaching pretty high levels of intelligence. They're definitely more intelligent than a significant fraction of like current humans already, and they can know a significant amount of things. I do fear that at some point you could have something similar to a Flume effect, where a very intelligent system is better at designing new systems that are better than its predecessors, and then it just starts like accumulating a significant amount of computation and energy in order to improve its own ability to think, and in doing so, it like becomes super intelligence that I do think that like basically we have absolutely no idea of how to make a super intelligence not want to do what the Avengers super intelligence did, which was like peace in this world, and then like it interpreted it as well. One way to get peace is by killing everyone, and then there's peace. So like to avoid that kind of mistake, we don't really know how to do that. The control problem definitely hasn't been solved. I've been dealing with that kind of thing since like 2004 or five. I went to Oxford. I was there while Bostrom was finishing writing Superintelligence, so I had a lot of discussions about AI with him. And yeah, I don't really know where we're going with that. What I do think is going to happen is like we're basically directing ourselves towards a future that's going to be very Binary, I think there's a good chance that we're going to be living in a world that is significantly better than the best heaven descriptions of the world's religions. And there's a much more significant chance that we're going to go extinct, but there isn't that much of a chance that we're going to just like stay in this in between. Like living in the mountain range is hard. Falling into one of the basins of attraction is relatively easier by comparison. So my take is that that's what's most likely to happen. I think it's about 85% extinction, 13% heaven-like system, 2% unknown unknowns, like God only knows what can happen in this world. And yeah, I do think that Kurzweil has a point when he says that at some point soon we'll have enough computational complexity and intelligence to simulate biology so that we don't need to wait for like actual physical time to elapse in order to determine how to stop and reverse aging. So I hope that at some point we get to the point where we can run like 10 years of simulation in a computer and then use those 10 years to figure out how to make something age 1 year slower. But those 10 years in a computer were just like an accelerated system that took like a month to do. So in 1 month, we learn how to get an extra year of life. And then, we keep doing that. And at some point, we get to live for basically as long as it takes for a bus to run over us. And what else? Carnivore, Anthropology.